So, my name is Michael Burke. I write regularly for a blog called Socialist Economic Bulletin. And in assessing the budget, I think it's quite important to begin with objective conditions. In my view, there's far too much focus on the detail of budgets rather than what they ought to be addressing, which is the key problems of the economy and whether they've done that successfully or not. So I think firstly, we have to make an assessment of where the economy is. That's the first point. And that's shown in this chart, which is GDP per capita. Now, it goes back to 2000. What it shows is that GDP per head was rising at a moderate pace in the period up to the global financial crash of 2007. What's happened since is that it hasn't really recovered from the global financial crash. So firstly, it crawls along from the impact of austerity, gradually picks up to slightly above where we were before the global financial crash. Then we had the complete mishandling of the COVID crisis and the lockdowns, and that was disastrous for the economy. A big fall, bigger than the global financial crash, which wasn't really followed by a strong recovery. A recovery in stages, whereas normally you'd expect a sort of V shape to an economic recovery after an event like that. And then what you've seen since, quite remarkably, as you see at the end of the chart, is GDP per capita is falling once again. So what you have is a situation where if you take from the end of last year back to before the global financial crash, and you see it on the chart, there's not much difference. Effectively, from 2007 to 2023, the economy's barely risen at all, and certainly not in per head terms. So that's a picture of stagnation punctuated by crises. And there's nothing on the horizon in terms of either the world economy or policy, which I'll come on to, which suggests that's going to change anytime soon. And we have some really startling effects of that, which is the rise in poverty, amongst others, and the decimation of public services. Now, if you look at the first chart, forget about the jargon, the EPC ratings and all. These are measures of poverty to include or not include heating costs. And what you see is that in the space of just a few years, 2013, on one measure, the proportion of the population in poverty has gone from 5% to just under 20%, that quadrupled in the space of 10 years. That's what the impact of a combination of extremely weak growth, more recently declines in living standards, along with what has been a redistribution of income and wealth from poor to rich and from workers to businesses. That's the effect of the austerity policies to make that redistribution take place. So that's one big effect. And then, as we know, everyone knows from their interaction with an experience of public services, they've been decimated over the same period. And you see something similar to the poverty charts in relation to NHS waiting lists, which is used as an example because it's such a stark example, but also it's one of the better sources of data. But we can look across public services and find very similar impact in just about every area, whether it's schools, hospitals in this case, public local services, you name it. Every aspect of life where the public sector is set up to provide, it's providing much less than it did before either the global financial crash or austerity, and then took another big hit during the COVID crisis and hasn't got any better since. And then just to reinforce that and the policy effects, we can move on now to the impact of the most recent Tory budget, the big flagship policy, which is the effect of which is shown in the table on the left as I look at it, as the national insurance cut. But what this clearly shows is if you're on a salary of 30,000, the annual saving you make from the national insurance cut is under £350. If you're on 100,000 or 50,000, the savings you make are more than double that. They're around £750. So it's a regressive tax measure when clearly poverty has been rising, and therefore logically the living standards of the poorest should be addressed, instead of which the flagship policy, the national insurance cut, was designed to help the better off, those on 50,000 a year plus. And it should be said, not shown on the table, is if you're earning something like, I think it's 14,000 or below, which includes many people, especially part-time workers who are still predominantly women, you gain nothing at all from the national insurance cut because you're not paying national insurance. You're too low paid to fall into that bracket. And so it's clear objectively that the Tory budget didn't address any of the fundamental factors in the economy, low growth, falling living standards, rising poverty, and public services in crisis. What it did was to continue and extend the main thrust of the austerity policy, which is to relatively improve the lot of people on high salaries, the higher paid, and do nothing for the rest. And underlying this, and this is the big thing I want to talk about in relation to the budget, is how all of this is being paid for or projected to be paid for. And what, in effect, the government is doing is planning very large cuts to government spending in the period after the next election, which is shown in that chart by the red dotted line. That's what the government is planning. And it may not seem much going from 45% of GDP down to 42% of GDP, but that's a 6% or more cut in total government spending. Now, if you think that on the one hand, the level of inflation in some public services like health is way higher than the rest of the economy, that the population is still growing and it's aging, that the demands on government spending would be that even to stand still, you would need to increase government spending. The idea of cutting government spending under these circumstances, where there's already a crisis of the public sector provision, is an outright scandal. It will mean really, really difficult and devastating impacts from a continuation of the austerity policy. And that's what it is. This is a really sharp austerity. If you look backwards or at the period what's shown on the chart from 2009, 2010, when austerity started, up to the enforced abandonment of that type of austerity under the impact of COVID, when the government had to increase spending. That's a really steep decline. Well, it's similarly steep in the projections for what's going to happen post-election. And we've already done this. There is no fat in local government spending. There is no fat in education spending. On the contrary, they're in crisis. So the idea that you can repeat a failed policy and expect a better outcome is ridiculous in these circumstances. It meets Einstein's definition of madness. But actually, you could add a further caveat that repeating it once we're now struggling with the first effects of austerity uh, will be truly devastating. And the reason that this is on the agenda at all is because there is no plan for growth. The antidote to problems of government finances is really quite simple. It's effectively to engineer growth, because then the revenues start to rise in terms of all types of taxation, even if the government does nothing, because people's living standards are rising, then revenues will increase. And similarly, even if the government does nothing, if the economy is improving, then spending goes down. The obvious things are on welfare bond. Loads of government spending falls indirectly because the effects of poverty and austerity start to ameliorate. So, for example, the health budget faces less pressures. This is the opposite. This is making a very bad situation worse because there is no growth plan. And now we come on, I think, to the key part of discussion about where we are in Labour policy. People may have seen reports of, I think it's pronounced the Mice lecture from Rachel Reeves, which turned out not to be entirely accurate because the text of the speech does not include the word Thatcher. And lots of the spin around it did. However, what we can say, two things certainly. When the speech says we are at an inflection point like the late 1970s, and the supply side reforms were needed to revive the economy, what we're talking about is Thatcherism. There's nothing else that happened in the late 1970s of a fundamental economic nature in this country that you could warrant talking about an inflection point. And similarly, it's often said, falsely, in my view, that Thatcher's main economic thrust was supply side reforms. So it's just not true. Supply side reform is economist jargon for policies which allow the existing levels of the means of production to deliver more production, because in certain ways you've freed up or removed obstacles to production that currently exists. That's the supply side reforms. Thatcher's so-called supply side reforms were destruction. So the steel industry was decimated, coal industry almost eliminated, transport was severely cut back, and so on and so on. And the flip side of that was, of course, a big rise in the level of financial services in the economy. So the supply side reforms are actually decimation of industry. Now, Rachel Reeves can't possibly mean that, not least because that industry can't be abolished twice. You can't shut the coal industry, it's been done. You can't decimate the steel industry because it's largely already been done. And no one, I think, believes that cutting investment in public transport is a good idea, even though that's actually what we've had with the failure to redirect the monies from abandoning HS2. So what can it possibly mean to refer to the period of the late 1970s and supply side reforms? I personally don't think it means very much. Having read the other materials about what Labour plans are, there's some planned improvements in apprenticeships. There's a commitment to greater lifelong learning. And after that, I'm struggling. There is no surge in public investment, which would be desperately needed, and I'll come on to. And talk of removing barriers to building homes as a way to tackle the housing crisis is for the birds. the National Audit Office shows that the main so-called home builders in this country are land bankers. They hold on to land to keep the prices of their own assets, land and housing up. And they certainly don't release it when the housing market is struggling. They hold on to it even more to keep prices high. So the idea that they're prevented, maybe at the margin, one or two places, but that's the key issue in the housing market, is just not correct. So I don't think it actually means very much, but I think it's a misunderstanding. And the misunderstanding is important on one area. That is, what is the alternative? Because it's really Thatcherite policies that have been in place since 1979 in terms of deregulation, privatization, curbs on union rights, and so on, which have got us into this mess. None of it has worked. And what is crucially ignored in all the paeans to Thatcher is that the revenues from North Sea oil and gas were, in many years of her premiership, greater than the growth in GDP. Or you can put that another way, if it hadn't been for the luck of the windfall of North Sea oil arriving when it did, most years of Thatcher would have been recession. They would have been negative growth. And I suspect she wouldn't have seen it out to 1990 if that had been the case. The idea that you can repeat Thatcherism and expect success, if you're going to do that, you need to have solid expectations of another North Sea oil and gas windfall, which ain't happening. And I've put in this table alongside what actually happened. In the 31 years before 1979, in the post-war period, average GDP in this country was 3%. In the 31 years after, or of Thatcher, from 79 onwards and after, it fell to 1.9%. And since 2010, it's fallen to 1%. So it's on a downward trajectory. And that is a direct product of Thatcherism and a failure to reverse it. And this is my last chart, you'll be pleased to hear, or last two in the same page. And they're both from the Office for Budget Responsibility. And what you see from the second chart, the G7 non-dwelling investment, and that's, that's what those of us who of a certain age would have called investment in the means of production, because housing doesn't produce new goods. So investment in the means of production has been lower in Britain than in almost every other country for almost the entirety of the period from 2016 onwards. There have been occasional periods when it's been a bit lower in Japan. But this is why Britain has the worst economic performance. This is the fundamental reason. Because without investment, you don't have the means, don't have new means of production. Without new means of production, it's extremely hard to increase production. And that's the fundamental reason for the economic crisis. I want you to look at the first chart, which is the Office for Budget Responsibility puts charts up of its own forecasts for business investment and compares them to the outturn. And they've got in other places, which I didn't show because they can be a little bit confusing just in the presentation, what they call hedgehog charts, which is where the outturn is pretty flat, but the forecasts keep on being big spikes higher, i.e. like spikes on a hedgehog. The assumption is that things are going to get much better. They don't, and they aren't, and they haven't. And a crucial way of improving the dire performance of business investment in this country is not deregulation, is not cutting their taxes, both of which have been tried endlessly without success. The way to improve investment, firstly, in this country is to increase public investment. One, the investment total will increase as a result or be larger than it otherwise would have been. But two, it has another effect because the private sector doesn't operate in isolation. it will employ resources, be it labor or capital, from the private sector. So the private sector is then, bits of it at least, are then obliged to increase their own output and their own investment just to meet that demand from the public sector. If we want to get out of the crisis, we need to have the opposite of Thatcherism rather than messing around talking about repeating inflection points of the 1970s.